Welcome to the Deep Dive. We're here to sift through, well, a pretty massive stack of research, news, history, basically everything we can find. Our goal is to pull out the essential insights, the things you really need to know about the world's most complex and lasting power structures. Today, we're tackling the global tycoons playbook. We want to dissect the actual mechanisms, how these huge fortunes get built, how they're kept, and how they're used across different times, different industries.
Right. We're looking at sources that span quite a range. You've got the 19th century guys, Rockefeller, Carnegie, people like that, then all the way up to modern finance, the tech founders we see today, global players. And what's striking really is how much continuity there is in the underlying strategy. It's never just about making money, is it?
No, absolutely not. It's about mastering the flow of capital, but also knowing how to read and navigate the political winds, and maybe even more critical, how they shape the way the public sees them. That seems key.
It is, because the money itself doesn't exist in a vacuum. It's about translating that wealth into influence. It's about understanding that intersection of capital and power. How do they make the money? Sure, but why does that wealth give them so much sway? That's what we're digging into, thinking critically about big money, how it moves around the globe.
Exactly. And when you look at the real titans, the ones who become globally influential, not just, rich, there's this pattern. It takes more than just smarts in business. It's this almost clinical grasp of leverage, understanding the power structures they need to get around, or maybe even control. Okay, let's unpack this. Let's look at the foundations. How did these empires even start?
Well, we're really analyzing what happens when capital and power meet. People often think these figures just react to markets or rules, but the sources suggest they're often actively shaping those conditions. They operate in a sphere that's sort of beyond standard regulation sometimes, and that's why their wealth translates into this huge, sometimes hidden, global influence. It forces you to think differently about how wealth is distributed, how it concentrates.
Right, so thinking about origins, let's talk about the starting point, the foundations of fortune. We all know the classic narrative, especially in the West, right? The whole rags to riches story, from nothing to everything. But our sources, they kind of complicate that picture, particularly when you look outside the U.S. or Europe.
Oh, definitely. That idea of the penniless coolie becoming a financial godfather in one generation, it's powerful, romantic even. But sources looking at Southeast Asia's big tycoons, they suggest that kind of single-generation leap is incredibly rare. In many of those economies, which were often quite controlled, you usually needed some kind of existing access, maybe family ties, maybe community connections, sometimes even government links, however small.
So not quite starting from absolute zero.
It's very hard to find examples, according to one writer who specialized in overseas Chinese business. They looked hard for a tycoon who genuinely started with no scaffold at all, almost impossible. The system, in many places, just tends to favor those who already have even a slight leg up.
Interesting. That complexity contrasts sharply with some of the American icons, doesn't it? Men who were masters of crafting their own story. Andrew Carnegie, for instance. He built this image as the friend of labor. But the sources are pretty clear that was largely strategic, right? Rooted in business needs.
It was brilliant strategy, yeah. Think about the tough times like 1879, 1882. Competitors were shutting down mills because of strikes, wage disputes. It was chaos. But Carnegie, he kept his plants running full steam, often by being tougher on wages first, driving down costs when he could. But crucially, he avoided the complete shutdowns that crippled his rivals. The sources say he could fulfill orders at all hazards. That gave him huge market share when others were offline.
So he always seemed busy, even when the industry slowed. Dominance disguised as being labor-friendly. But the personal connection stuff, he kind of exaggerated that later on.
Oh, for sure. Especially in his autobiography and later life. He talked about this really close, intimate bond with his boys, his managers, and protégés. And while he definitely built loyalty, the sources say, look, outside of a few key people like Charlie Schwab, those relationships weren't that personal. He was managing his image, transforming himself, from a maybe ruthless industrialist to this benevolent father figure. The public needed that story.
And that theme of necessity driving the start?
Yeah.
It really comes through, not in polished boardrooms, but in constraint. Look at Sam Walton and Walmart.
Yeah.
The sources stress they started totally underfinanced.
Right on the edge. Sam and his wife, Helen, they had to pledge literally everything they owned for those initial loans. Helen signed all the notes, huge personal risk. But that very lack of cash became their advantage, ironically. Because they couldn't afford prime locations, they were forced to look where no one else was. These remote small towns that the big retailers just dismissed. Not enough demand, they thought.
They weren't trying to muscle into Dallas or New York. They found this whole untapped market.
Exactly. That constraint, that necessity, it revealed small-town America was completely underserved. Walmart blew up because they figured out how to serve those communities profitably. Lack of capital forced innovation in where they went. Necessity really was the mother of growth there.
And that focus on logistics, location as leverage. That's a lesson someone like John D. Rockefeller mastered way earlier.
Rockefeller got it. He knew moving stuff around was the key to monopoly. Look at 1863. He's agonizing over where to put his first big processing plants in Cleveland. He wasn't just thinking about local costs. He was obsessed with transport access. He put his plants right near the Atlantic and Great Western Railroad. That gave him access to the Erie line to New York and a direct link to the Pennsylvania oil fields.
Why was that dual access so important? Why agony over it?
Options. Flexibility. Being able to shift shipments between different rail lines and later, water routes too. It meant he could play the carriers against each other. If one railroad balked at giving him the special rates he wanted, he could just threaten to move all his massive volume to their competitor, instantly. That power, the threat of switching, let him demand preferential rates, rates that undercut everybody else. That laid the groundwork for Standard Oil's monopoly. Location was everything.
And once you have that kind of dominance, the public story, the rhetoric, becomes a weapon too. Henry Ford with the Model T, he wasn't just selling a car.
No, it was a whole social and political statement. He timed it perfectly to counter the anti-capitalist feelings growing at the time. Ford didn't talk about industrial efficiency when he announced it. He talked about leisure and enjoyment. His genius was framing it as a car for the great multitude. He promised a price so low that no man making a good salary will be unable to own one. He positioned himself not as a guy getting rich, but as the solution to the Industrial Revolution's problems, the one benefiting the common man.
Turning the Model T from just a product into, well, a necessity for the masses.
Yeah.
A philosophical one almost.
Exactly. Mass production wrapped in the language of democracy, happiness. Buying his car became like an act of economic citizenship. It's a classic tactic. When you get that big, you have to control the story about your purpose.
Fast forward to today. The speed of innovation creates these fascinating contrasts in how businesses start and grow. Our sources compare elite university labs, MIT, Stanford, with what they call the cutthroat entrepreneurial environment in places like China, especially with AI implementation.
Yeah, the difference in motivation is really interesting there. The sources argue that the big AI transformation, deep learning and all that, it won't just come out of pure academic research like you might see in top Western labs. China's edge often is this environment of down-to-earth, profit-hungry entrepreneurs. These are people teaming up with AI experts not to publish a paper, but to solve a real-world problem right now and make money doing it.
So it's the speed of application driven by that immediate profit motive. That's the key difference.
Pretty much. It's about intense, rapid commercialization. Failure happens a lot, sure, but when something works, it scales incredibly fast. The sources suggest that while Western labs might create the foundational science, the Chinese environment is maybe better structured to leverage that science into immediate, disruptive industrial power. Turning research into profit isn't just a goal, it's seen as a core national and commercial asset. Speed is everything.
That urgency, that drive for leverage and profit. Perfect transition to our next section, investment philosophy. Once the fortune's foundation is there, the focus shifts, right? Financial maneuvering, seeing ahead, exploiting market cycles.
And this mastery of maneuvering, it's timeless, often involves a willingness to break agreements or jump right back into competition. Cornelius Vanderbilt is a great historical example. He sold his big stake in Accessory Transit, that key route for gold rush traffic. You'd think maybe he'd step back, enjoy the payout.
But no, he jumped right back in as a competitor, didn't he? Aggressively.
Not just jumped back in, moved to crush them. His return immediately forced his rivals to jack their fares back up. We're talking $300 for first cabin, $150 for steerage. Huge sums back then. Vanderbilt wasn't just trying to make money. He was showing he could disrupt the whole market whenever he wanted, even after being paid to leave.
And the sources mentioned this made him instantly untrustworthy. The San Francisco newspaper called him slippery.
Incredible, right? His reputation was literally printed in the papers. Being totally ruthless, untrustworthy, he'd negotiate a deal to stay out of competition, take the cash, then immediately become an even fiercer rival. It sent a message. His word meant nothing if profit or power was on the line. He kind of embraced being slippery.
That ability to exploit the cycle, especially downturns, we see that today with modern finance.
Yeah.
The whole vulture game in private equity.
Ah, yes, the vulture game. It's basically capitalizing on crisis. After a big crash like the one after the mid-2000s credit bubble burst, veteran firms, Oaktree, Ares, Cerberus, those types, they're ready. They swoop in, buy up distressed debt, hoping to take control of failing companies, buying assets cheap when everyone else is
And
panicking.
often it's PE firms buying from other PE firms, right?
Yeah.
Like Apollo taking over Monier Group from PI Partners.
Exactly. One firm's failure, often fueled by too much debt, becomes another's highly leveraged opportunity. They use that distressed debt to flip from being creditors to owners. And doing this successfully requires incredibly deep, almost obsessive financial analysis, which is where firms like Blackstone really shine.
Yeah, the sources talk about Blackstone pushing partners to forecast performance down to tiny details, way beyond normal projections.
That rigor was key. They needed to spot hidden value, find weak spots. They'd forecast everything. The sources even mentioned stuff like how many Coca-Colas they're buying in their conference rooms. Tiny details. But then they added this other layer, crucial for global players, factoring in fluke events.
The sources call it optionality. Can you break that down for listeners? What does optionality mean here?
It's about preparing for the improbable, not just predicting the likely. Standard forecasting looks at the main scenarios, the known knowns. Optionality is about considering those extreme outlier events, the fluke events, that could totally sink a company or make it wildly successful. High risk, high reward. They're not just looking at balance sheet risks. They're searching for those hidden pivot points, those unforeseen things that can multiply returns. Planning for the black swans, basically.
Of course, the public markets are where these strategies often meet public view, and sometimes, yeah, it looks like cynical exploitation. There's a really blunt quote in our sources from a former Morgan Stanley MD about a major Asian tycoon, Ka-shing, often called Superman, in Hong Kong.
Right, Ka-shing, legendary figure in Asia, classic rags to riches story refugee from China, started with plastic flowers, built this huge global empire in ports, real estate, utilities, controlled huge chunks of Hong Kong's infrastructure. He's widely admired, especially in Hong Kong, for that journey. But this Morgan Stanley director, the comment was harsh. To me, it is a totally cynical exploitation of a public that adores him but doesn't know better.
Wow. That implies he's deliberately using that public trust, that heroic image, to pull off deals that maybe aren't great for everyone else.
It suggests that the adoration, the carefully crafted image, let him do things in the public markets deals that benefited him and insiders potentially at the expense of ordinary shareholders who just trusted his reputation. That kind of cynicism, or maybe just extreme ambition, can get totally detached from reality, which leads to things like WeWork.
Oh yeah, the WeWork saga. The founder wasn't just aiming for success. He wanted the biggest valuation, period. The sources capture this delusion, believing that hitting some massive valuation number would make world leaders call him when countries started shooting at one another.
It's a wild insight into that modern Titan mindset, isn't it? Valuation stops being just about money. It becomes a symbol of geopolitical significance, moral authority almost. But then the IPO started to wobble and reality hit. The sources reveal that the claim they could just stop expanding and instantly be profitable, smoke and mirrors. That whole ambition was built on shaky ground, led to huge disillusionment among staff, worthless stock options, a mess.
Seems like that intense belief, bordering on delusion, might be needed to raise billions, but the fallout is massive when it crumbles, and when ambition crosses into actual deception, you get Theranos.
Theranos is the dark side of that coin. When their main tech, the mini lab, didn't work, it was faulty, couldn't run the tests reliably, they decided to launch anyway using the older, standard Edison device. That led directly to the decision, as the sources put it, to cheat.
And the cheating involved dodging the very oversight that would have caught the problems.
Exactly. They decided to use the faulty device, but only inside their own labs. Keep it hidden from external eyes, basically. This drive for the biggest valuation, for that Titan status, completely overrode scientific integrity. It required systematically misleading everyone, partners, investors, regulators, shows how fast ethics can evaporate when deception seems like the only way to keep the story going.
Which brings us perfectly to Section 4. We're shifting from the internal money-making mechanics to the external world, navigating political tides and regulatory arbitrage. How immense wealth allows tycoons to, well, sometimes effectively control the state or find loopholes to operate outside its rules.
Yeah, in many developing or emerging economies, that line between huge private wealth and state power just blurs completely. The sources talk about Thailand, for instance. The rise of Thaksin Shinawatra literally brought some of the country's wealthiest business figures directly into government power. It superseded the older ways of just influencing politics.
They call it big money politics. How did Thaksin's own wealth directly lead to rule changes benefiting his company, Shincor?
It was incredibly direct and fast. Once his allies were in ministerial positions, policy started changing almost immediately to favor Shin Corporation. Like, they put state-run mobile competitors on hold, basically kneecapping competition in telecoms. They blocked deregulation efforts that would have helped rivals. So instead of just lobbying, the tycoons were the government. They shaped the rules to maximize their own profits.
And pulling off these kinds of maneuvers often relies on keeping things really opaque, right? Hard to track the money, the assets.
Opacity was absolutely critical in Indonesia after the Asian financial crisis. Tycoons hid what they were doing, shipped huge amounts of capital out, especially to places like Singapore, and they did these complex deals with the government over bad debts. They'd hand over domestic assets, often of questionable quality or inflated value, to settle debts. But it didn't end there.
They tried to buy them back later.
Exactly. They'd then try to buy back the very same assets they'd just offloaded, but for way less than the value they claimed when handing them over. It's this cycle. Profit from crisis, use global capital flight to hide money, leverage opacity, and ensure the tycoons come out on top, not the government or the public.
And that ability to operate across borders opaquely can even extend to things that actively undermine global security, like the arms dealer Victor Bout.
Bout's operation was a masterclass in using legitimate business as cover. His network flew humanitarian aid, normal stuff like flowers, beef, right alongside huge arms shipments. He'd openly supply both sides in conflicts, just claiming to be an air transport guy.
And the sources say he seemed almost untouchable, protected by senior Russian officials.
Yes, and attempts by the U.S. to go after him got tangled up in huge geopolitical games. After 9/11, the Bush administration desperately wanted Russia as an ally against terrorism. So U.S. officials worried that prosecuting Bout, who seemed to have high-level protection, could damage that crucial alliance. It led to delays, inaction, sending, as the sources put it, the wrong message. Bout's individual case became less important than the bigger diplomatic picture.
This idea of wealth as political weaponry, we see it domestically too, through dark money or direct influence.
For sure. Look at financiers who have very personal, very specific reasons to fear government oversight. Stephen A. Cohen, for example. His fund, SAC Capital, was facing a massive criminal investigation for insider trading. And where does Cohen show up? At Koch donor summits. The sources explicitly link this. The wealthiest often had personal reasons to fear a more assertive federal government. Their money becomes a direct tool to push back against regulations that threaten their specific business model, sometimes illicit ones.
And using non-monetary assets, like media, for political leverage. That's not new either. William Randolph Hearst was doing this long before hedge fund taxes.
Hearst absolutely understood that controlling the narrative was political power. He used his newspapers, like the Chicago American, not just to endorse people, but to actively demand favors. The sources detail how he'd give explicit instructions to politicians like William Jennings Bryan, telling them exactly what to say, how to phrase it in open letters, which would then run right on the front page of Hearst's papers.
So he was basically dictating policy and public statements through his own media outlets.
Absolutely. He was leveraging the trust and readership his papers had built, especially among working people. His power was so obvious that even the Socialist Party warned voters not to be fooled by this supposed friend of labor. They reminded people that underneath it all, Hearst was just another capitalist using his assets for political gain.
And circling back to regulatory arbitrage, the modern example is Theranos again, navigating that no man's land.
It's a perfect example of creating a loophole by being selectively compliant, by only running their proprietary mini-lab devices inside their own labs. They managed to avoid triggering the really strict FDA scrutiny for years. The FDA's toughest rules apply more to devices sold externally to hospitals or clinics. Internal use was a gray area.
And they kept up appearances too.
Crucial, they publicly said they supported regulating these lab-developed tests, LDTs. They even voluntarily submitted some other tests for approval. But it was all a smokescreen. It kept the core faulty device hidden while maintaining that veneer of legitimacy needed to keep raising money and fooling partners.
This journey, from building the fortune to wielding political power and navigating rules, it leads us to Section V, legacy, philanthropy, and the globalization of wealth. After accumulating all this, the tycoons face the question, what do you do with it? How do you shape how you're remembered?
And it often involves a huge philosophical shift, or at least presenting one publicly. Andrew Carnegie, after selling his steel empire, talked about feeling this strange, inescapable melancholy. Just piling up dollars wasn't enough anymore. His solution was immediate, radical, pivot entirely to distributing them.
He didn't hang around. The scale of that first move was incredible.
Massive. He jumped right into philanthropy, gave away what would be billions today, started with $10.2 million just for New York libraries and his former Pittsburgh workers. It was partly to deal with that melancholy, sure, but also, clearly, to rewrite his legacy. From ruthless industrialist to pioneer of public giving.
John D. Rockefeller had a strategic approach to legacy, too, but focused more on family, succession, favoring his son Junior over his daughters and dividing the wealth.
And the reason given was very specific and public. Rockefeller Sr. claimed Jr. was the only one who could carry on his philanthropic and charitable work in the same spirit which had activated him. Jr. was positioned as a surrogate, validating the father's life through continuing the philanthropy.
Kind of like self-validation through estate planning.
Pretty much. Rockefeller faced enormous public criticism for how he built Standard Oil, so arguing that only a good tree brought forth good fruit. Presenting Junior's virtuous philanthropy as proof of the father's own fundamental goodness was a powerful defense.
And in the modern era, George Soros really represents that intellectual approach to philanthropy. Honoring Karl Popper, the philosopher behind his Open Society Fund, Soros even called philanthropy an ego trap he wanted to avoid, but he got more and more involved.
Soros, always the strategic thinker, basically applied his financial brain to global political and social issues. His involvement went way beyond just donating money. The sources describe him deep in late night, talks about very specific political strategies, like how private foreign capital could support independent groups in totalitarian countries. He sought global influence by funding the infrastructure of democracy and open debate to counter authoritarianism.
And this global focus really highlights the final point here: the power of the trans-global elite. As capital flows freely across borders, national governments just struggle to keep up.
The economist Thomas Piketty really emphasizes this. He notes a huge chunk, a substantial fraction of global financial assets are deliberately hidden in offshore tax havens. This makes it incredibly hard for anyone, even national statistics agencies, to accurately track global wealth dynamics. Where is the money, really? Who owns it?
So we're basically flying blind, trying to understand the true concentration of global power.
Largely, yes. And what emerges is this new class, the super rich, described as a transglobal community of peers. Doesn't matter if they're based in New York, London, Hong Kong, Moscow. They increasingly have more in common with each other, their lifestyles, strategies, worries, than with people in their home countries. Their assets are global, their wealth often hitched to the booming East. They operate in this interconnected world that often floats above national rules, giving them huge power to pick and choose their environment.
So what does this all mean? We've done our deep dive into the tycoons' playbook. We've seen these common threads across time, the relentless strive for profit, yes, but also exploiting cycles, navigating politics, using leverage, and then that final complex choice about legacy.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the sheer scale of private capital now lets these figures operate in this incredibly fluid, transglobal way. They essentially have the option to just sidestep regulations or political problems in one country by moving their capital or headquarters elsewhere. Or, when it suits them, they can exert massive influence locally through sheer financial power, like that big money politics we talked about. This ability to shift focus, assets, allegiance, depending on where the advantage lies globally. That's maybe the defining trait of the modern titan.
Which leaves us with a final thought, something directly from the sources we look at today for you to chew on. How has the idea of discretion changed in our age of celebrity CEOs? The sources noted John D. Rockefeller Sr. actively avoided showing off his wealth. He was sort of the Puritan capitalist, valued privacy, was apparently embarrassed by the outward signs of the social recognition which he receives, like he was hiding something.
Right. And that desire to stay low-key feels worlds away from the modern founder who seems to love the spotlight, right? The ones constantly photographed, quoted, maybe enjoying the fame as much as the fortune. We saw a hint of that shift even with Carnegie later in life, starting to enjoy the public adulation.
So we'd encourage you to think, is that kind of Rockefeller-style discretion even possible for a global titan anymore? Or has the need to constantly manage public perception, to be visible, to control the narrative, has that completely replaced the quiet accumulation of power that marked some of the earlier tycoons?